Hello guys and welcome to the complete game development series, and my name is JT. I'll be your instructor the entire time, and now you're looking at the first installment of the series where we'll be covering the fundamentals of programming. So in this tutorial series we'll be talking about C#, which is a very user-friendly high-level programming language developed by Microsoft, which is also being used by the most popular game engine, the Unity game engine. So we'll be focusing on the fundamentals of coding here, and we'll not be covering much about game development. And I think that's important that we separate the two different things, right? It is important to know the fundamentals of coding first before you jump into actual game coding. And many tutorials just jump into the engine and start coding right away. And I think that's actually a mistake, because without knowing the fundamentals, and you're most of the times just following people and try to mimic what they're doing without knowing exactly what's happening, and that's potentially dangerous. And I think it's important that we cover the fundamentals first, and that's the purpose of this first installment. Okay, so just to give you a broader view of what's next, right? After the first one, we'll be covering actual game development. In the second installment, where we'll be making this game called the Infinite Runner game, and this is where we actually cover the fundamentals of the Unity game engine and game development in general, right? We'll be building this game from scratch, and then after that we'll have a full-blown mobile game development. The game is called the Exterminator, that will be covering various game mechanics in detail, and things like character movement control, right? The health, damage, and death and animation system, right? The inventory system, the UI, and also the enemy, their AI behavior, their AI perception, right? All those kind of things in depth. This is where we really go to town to game development, right? You can see now how the three installments are designed to go from the fundamentals to more detailed, right? And then here you're gonna have to ask yourself, right, where you are. Are you a beginner? Have you done any coding, right? If you haven't, I do encourage you to go through the three installment or three series in the sequential order that they're laid out, because they're all depending on or built on the previous one. But however, if you have been coding for a while now, you know the fundamentals of C#, then it's probably better for you to just jump into the second one and start coding the game, right? There's no need to waste time to learn the basics again if you know them already. But again, if you need a refresher, you can of course watch the first one here first, right before jumping in. And of course, in a bit, I'll be laying out exactly what we're covering, so you can have an overview of exactly what's needed before making that decision. Alrighty, so yes, let's go ahead and take a look at what are we going to cover in this first tutorial. So we'll be talking about the C# fundamentals, the basic concepts of programming. So concepts like variables and containers, which is basically where we store data. And then we'll be talking about the operators, which is how we operate on data, like adding numbers together, things like that. And then we'll also be talking about the flow control, right? Things like if statement, if else, while, for loop, switch, those kind of things. That's basically how we direct the execution order of our code. And then eventually some very basic things about input, right? So don't be worried if you don't know any of those concepts. We'll be covering those guys in detail. I'm just laying out them in the sequential order so you know how they're introduced. And then yeah, next will be functional programming, and we'll be talking about what is a function, what are arguments and their return types, delegates and events, and generics, right? Those basic functional programming concepts, which is very important before moving on to the next, which is the object-oriented programming, or OOP. This is a very popular concept that the game industry uses a lot, especially in Unity. Every new script you create is basically a class, right? And we'll be talking about, of course, what is a class, and then what are constructor and destructors, and then what is a field or member functions, right, for a class, and then what's protection level. This one is actually very important important. Many Unity coders just like to use public all the time, which is fundamentally wrong, and we'll be talking about why they're wrong and how can we provide the correct protection for our fields and members, right? And of course that leads to the setters and getters, modifiers or accessors, right? And talk about inheritance and polymorphism, which are very useful concepts of class that allows us to do high-level abstraction and reuse our code. And then we'll be talking about interfaces, which is kind of like another variant of classes. On lower level language, there's no difference between class inheritance and interfaces in C#. It's two different concepts. But again, this is kind of like an alternative way to organize the code better sometimes. And eventually we'll be just covering a little bit of the structure concept, which is an older concept from the C language, kind of like a stripped version or a simpler version than class, and it's used to bundle data and functionality together. All right. And then after that, we'll be talking about data structures and a little bit of an algorithm, I guess. So those things are classes, right? This concept or this type of things are learned or taught in almost all computer science degrees in their sophomore year, sometimes freshman year even, right? And those are very important when it comes to dealing with a lot of data, like your user data, like you have 1 million users, how do you store them, right? Those kind of things, or you have quite a lot of different inventory items, right? You're gonna have to pick a correct data structure to store them so that you can easily iterate, query, and alter them, right? We'll be implementing the dynamic array from scratch, although C# offers one already, right? But we'll just try to do it again just to understand how it's working internally, and so that when you're using it, you have informed knowledge to know how to use it properly. And then of course we'll be introducing the enumerable interface, which is needed for any data structure or functions to be able to iterate or go through the for each loop, basically. And then of course, yeah, those concepts will be covered in detail, so again, don't worry if you don't know anything about them. And this is just the introduction of the first and then also the first 3 installments of the tutorial series. But in the future, we'll also be covering the real king of game development when it comes to programming, which is the C++ programming language, and all the game engines we'll be using, Unity, Godot, or Unreal Engine. They are all developed in C++, right? So you just cannot really get away with C++. Many people hate it, but I personally have a hate and love relationship to C++. It is a pretty powerful language. It's difficult, it's wordy, but it's super powerful, and it is the language to go when it comes to developing games. So we'll be covering that in the 4th, and then after that we'll be covering the Unreal Engine, right? We'll be doing some real serious game development there. We'll be making multiplayer games. We'll be utilizing many features in the Unreal game engine, which is a much bigger and feature-rich game engine than Unity, and we'll be, of course, right, cover that in a later stage. Alrighty, that's enough of me rambling. I think we're all eager and ready, right, to jump into the actual tutorials. And of course, right, don't hesitate to ask me if you got any questions, right? I'll try my best to answer them as soon as possible. And yeah, I'll be seeing you guys in the videos. Happy coding!